Hello and welcome to Foreign Affairs Focus. My name is Jonathan Tepperman. I'm the managing editor of Foreign Affairs. Our guest today is Jerry Curtis, who is a professor of political science at Columbia University, one of, if not the country's, that is the United States, foremost experts on Japan, and the author of a foreign affairs article on Japan, most recently in our March-April issue, Japan's Cautious Hawks. And he's graciously come into our studios today to talk to us about all things Japan related. So, Jerry, good to see you. Thanks for coming in. This is an unusually exciting time to talk about Japan because Japan is proving unusually exciting. I want to ask you about Shinzo Abe first, who I think despite many people's expectations has got off to a remarkably strong start as Prime Minister. Tell me first about economics, where he seems to be making great strides and the Japanese economy is responding already. What exactly has he done and how's he done it?
Well, first of all, he was Prime Minister of Japan 6 years ago.
Right.
He lasted 1 year. It was a disaster. He talked a lot about kind of abstract issues and long-term issues, creating a beautiful country. He learned a lot in 6 years, clearly, and he came in this time understanding it's the economy, stupid, and that's been his what he's been emphasizing. So, and he has great branding, Abenomics, 3 arrows. He shot 2 arrows already. One is fiscal stimulus, 10 trillion yen. Supplemental budget to the last major budget, and then an inflation target, basically strong-arming the Bank of Japan into adopting a 2% inflation target. And then he was lucky because the term of the governor ended, so he was able to appoint somebody, Mr. Kuroda, who supported his position. So this got the markets very excited, but even more importantly, it's gotten Japanese hopeful and optimistic for the first time in years. So he shot these 2 arrows. It's been a great success. You have to give the man a lot of credit for what he accomplished in 3 months. And his first 100 days were quite quite remarkable, given what he's done before, and given that's not the way Japanese prime ministers usually behave.
Right. And is this combination of stimulus and quantitative easing already having an effect on the economy?
Not much yet. It takes getting that money actually pumped out into the economy and starting to see the results takes a little while, but it's had an effect on had an effect in the sense that the public feels more confident that the economy is going to get better. So you already see them starting to loosen up their purse strings. Purchases, especially of high-end goods, is increasing, and of course because of the inflation targeting, the yen is depreciated. So that's a great boom for Japanese export industries. So consumer electronics and others that were suffering, particularly relative to Korea, are doing much better right now. So so there's already been some effect. The key is whether there's a third arrow in his bow, which, let
me guess, structural reform?
Structural reform, what he calls a growth strategy. This is tough because fiscal stimulus and inflation targeting, it's sense kind of pain-free for the vested interests and for the average people. But if you're going to have real structural reform, you got to take on a lot of people who aren't going to like it. Vested interests, like in agriculture, or the older people. It's it's an aging society, but Social Security reform has to come. That's the question about it.
And Japan, of course, has a bad history of economic stimulus that gets frittered away on bridges to nowhere that prove maybe useful shots in the arm for the economy, but not helpful to the country overall. How optimistic are you that this stimulus will be matched by real reform? That is, he'll manage to push through the kind of big measures that, as far as I understand it, no one since Prime Minister Koizumi has managed to effect.
I'm very skeptical.
Why is that?
I don't see any evidence yet that he's decided what his priorities are in the way of deregulation and structural reform. You can't do everything. Doing 2 or 3 things takes a huge amount of political capital. Will he be able in the next couple of months to figure out what that is and put all his energy into it? Not if he decides to shift his focus to things like constitutional revision and other issues. He has to keep his eye on the bullseye, which is the economy, and he has to be very specific about what he wants to do. The one but I'm a skeptic, but I'm not pessimistic. I mean, I hope he succeeds. One big question is whether he uses this Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation, so-called TPP, that Japan is going to join, to bring about real agricultural reform in Japan. If he does, and reform of medical services and so on, yeah, it can work, but the fundamental problems, aging society, declining population, underutilization of women in the workforce, no sensible immigration policy, overregulation, too much central control, and not dealing with these issues.
So let's turn quickly to foreign policy, which was the subject of your piece for us in March, April. As you wrote, and as others have noticed, there was a lot of trepidation when Abe came into office because of the nationalist comments that he had made in the campaign and in his career before that. It seems that we've seen a real moderation since he's, as you predicted, since he's taken the job. How do you rate him as a foreign policy, whether it's vis-a-vis? Well, China is the big issue, so let's just stick to that.
Well, I wrote that issue because I thought the reaction in this country, in our country, to his being a right-winger was being overdone. He is ideologically on the right, but he's a pragmatic realist who approaches foreign policy with a very cautious has a very cautious approach. So I'm not surprised. I am relieved that my prediction is so far turning out right. I think he's likely to continue that way because he understands that Japanese national interests are not improved by heightening tensions with South Korea, which is another U.S. ally, which would be problems for relations with the U.S., or with China, which they have to get along with if they possibly can. So I'd rate him so far as having done extremely well on the foreign policy side. He's tried to avoid provoking China. He's tried to avoid responding to their escalation over this island problem, over the Senkaku Islands. I think he's being very careful on these history issues, which are really hot button, very, very dangerous issues in relations with neighbors, especially South Korea. So far, so good.
You mentioned constitutional revision, and here I should say we're talking about presumably revising Japan's self-defense or the Article 9 of its constitution, which forbids it from having an active military. The trick with being a cautious Japanese Japanese leader is that the neighborhood doesn't always make that very easy. And can you see, or are you afraid that further provocation from North Korea, or from China for that matter, could lead Abe-san to decide to push forward with constitutional revision, or a more robust Japanese military posture? He's
been very cool-headed about the North Korean problem. I think his view, and I think it's the right view, is that the North Koreans are not going to use nuclear weapons. They're not going to start a war unless they want to commit suicide, and they're not irrational. They have these weapons as a deterrent and to try to blackmail other people. So I don't think the North Korean issue as such is in any case, he's not using it to sort of rally nationalist sentiment behind a big military buildup. The issue is China. Whether China decides it wants to get along with its neighbors or it wants to try to bully them. The more they try to bully Japan, the more public support there'll be in Japan for Abe to move the country further to the right. So this issue, I think Abe is okay on these issues. He's cautious, and I think he's trying to be reasonable. I think the real question here is whether the Chinese try to push their weight around. If they want a right-wing, hawkish government in Japan that's going to take a very hard anti-China line, they should just keep on doing what they're doing now.
Jerry, we have time for one more question. Japan has big elections coming up this summer. What influence is that having on policy now, and what outcome do you see for the elections?
Well, the outcome, it's hard to imagine anything except a huge LDP victory, partly because the opposition is self-destructed. The Democratic Party, which was in power until a few months ago, is on the verge of actually disappearing or disintegrating. The LDP will do very well. Right now, the policy issues relevant to the election, they haven't really been grappled with yet. I mean, it's not clear what he's going to focus on. He may focus on the constitutional revision issue. But TPP, which a lot of people thought he would wait to do until after the election, he was very smart. Japan has changed. 20 years of stagnancy has made a lot of people believe things have to change. 3 years of actually being out of office has changed the LDP. So they're not as beholden. They don't see that, the vested interest didn't deliver in the last, the election before last. They lost power. Now they're back, and they're not quite as responsive, which is why he was able to decide to go forward with TPP. It's very popular. Now, look, as long as the economy seems to be getting better, come July when the elections are held, if it's still optimism about the economy, his party will do extremely well. Then we will see whether he can go forward with the economic reforms, whether he decides to put his energies behind a nationalist agenda. Those are the questions that face him. But right now, you have to say that he's done a lot to change the mood and to get people interested in Japan again. So I'm very pleased to see that.
Wonderful. Jerry Curtis, thanks so much for talking to Foreign Affairs.
My pleasure. Thank you.